I would yield 5 minutes to a leading advocate for social impact financing, and I know a partner of Mr. Young, our colleague John Delaney of Maryland.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my good friend and colleague from Texas for yielding me this time, and I want to express my support for his comments and associate myself with his comments. He has been a singular champion of the TANF program and the goals that it represents, and I appreciate his work and the opportunity to work with him on this bill. I also want to thank my good friend and colleague from Indiana. We have spent a considerable amount of time working on this piece of legislation together, talking to groups, and he has been a wonderful champion, and it's been a real pleasure to work with you on this concept. Mr. Speaker, prior to coming to Congress, I spent my whole career as an entrepreneur in the private sector building businesses. And the one thing I would observe from that experience, whenever I would travel around the United States or around the world for that matter, whenever you saw good economic outcomes and broad-based prosperity for the citizens, you always found a situation where the government, the nonprofit sector, and the private sector worked well together to solve the problems in society. And it's that spirit that animates the social impact partnership that we're here to discuss this evening. And if you think about what's going on in the world today, Mr. Speaker, and the changes that are playing out in our economy based on technological innovation and global interconnection, you realize that it's helped many of our citizens, and it's helped billions of people around the world. But it's also hurt many of our citizens. It happened too fast, we weren't quite prepared for it, and chronic and vexing issues like poverty, educational disparities, income and opportunity disparities have only grown based on these trends. And to make a difference against these problems, Mr. Speaker, we need to do several things. First, we need to invest. You cannot definitionally make transformative changes, whether it be in the private sector or the public sector, unless you make investments. The second thing we need, Mr. Speaker, is we need innovation. We need the best ideas to be applied against some of these very difficult challenges that we have. And, Mr. Speaker, we also need a new sense and spirit of collaboration and cooperation among all the stakeholders. Because the government right now, Mr. Speaker, has three significant problems when it tries to tackle these issues. The first problem it has is a funding problem. Whether it's the condition of the federal budget or the state budgets, it's very difficult for the government to make investments. The second issue the government has is an innovation problem. Mr. Speaker, I think we all know that the government has never been the incubator necessarily of great innovation. It's been good at investing, but we find more innovation often outside of government. And right now that gap is growing. So the government has an innovation problem. And the third problem the government has is a transparency problem. I used to say in business that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And we are not getting enough data in terms of a positive feedback loop to look at some of these issues and see what works and what doesn't work. And that's why pay-for-success frameworks and social impact partnerships can make such a big difference, because it solves those problems. It creates pathways for more capital, more investments to flow from the nonprofit sector or the private sector against issues that have traditionally been funded by the government. It creates pathways for innovation and for best ideas and new ideas to flow into the government sector. And it creates a pathway and a framework for more transparency and more metrics as it relates to what the results are. Whether it's applied against early childhood education, recidivism issues, chronic health care issues like asthma, whatever the framework can be, this approach can create an opportunity for more investment, which we need, more innovation, which we need, greater metrics and transparency, which we need, and a renewed spirit of cooperation between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector to make a difference against these problems, which is why I'm very supportive of the Social Impact Partnership Framework, the Pay-for-Success Framework, and I encourage my colleagues to support the legislation. But I also encourage my colleagues to think seriously about what my colleague from Texas said about the larger TANF program, because there's so much more to be done. But I do believe launching the Social Impact Partnership Framework can lead to transformative changes against these very, very difficult issues and create a situation where prosperity is shared more broadly, there's more opportunity for the Americans, particularly our American colleagues who have been so affected negatively by some of the larger changes that are going on in the world, and I encourage adoption of the bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.